Hello everyone. Today we'll discuss about DNS. So DNS stands for Domain Name Service. So what I mean by this domain name services? So normally we try to type in our browser with the mnemonics like www.google.com. So when this www.google.com, which will be understood by the browser or for me, but this mnemonic will not be understood by the routers. So for a router, I should translate this mnemonics into an IP address. So now who will translate this mnemonics or the host name into IP address? So that will be done by DNS, domain name system. Right? So whatever the host name you give, either www.youtube.com or www.gmail.com, whatever it is, all the host name should be translated into its IP address. Then now the question arises, who will give the IP address? Where I can generate these IP address and all. See one thing, whenever first when I create my own website, okay, so I should register that website. During the registration of that website, they'll ask what is the IP address of your website and all, right? So for your kind information, the website address, that is the IP address, looks like something like this. Might be you might have not come up to this time. Okay. Okay, now this is the IP address. You can see this is how it represents by using a dotted decimal numbers. So 121.7.106.83. So this is the representation of an IP address. Okay, so now I want to convert this www.google.com into this kind of IP address. So normally these numbers, whatever I've written, 121, this one single digit can have the maximum of 255. So it can have 255.255.255.255. This is the maximum range it can have, starting from 0 to 255. Now this is what IP address is. In the later classes, we'll study more about the IP address. Okay. So now, as I told, this host name should be converted into, translated into IP address. Now who will do this? The domain name system will do this. Now, as I told before, I register my website. For that website, I want to give what is my IP address for that website. Now, the database of this will be maintained by the domain name system, right? So now there are actually telling there are several hierarchical things will be there in order to get the IP address from the host name. So that we are going to see now. Now, the first thing is what are the services provided by the DNS. The first thing is there are two ways to identify a host. As of right now, we have studied. There are two ways to identify a host. One is host name, the other one is IP address. Okay. As I told you before, these host name are something like the mnemonic which will be preferred by the people, but the IP address and all should be should be there in order to understand by the routers. Now, what are the main tasks of this DNS is the first point is this DNS should maintain a distributed database. Okay, a distributed database should be maintained in the servers. That server is nothing but called as DNS servers. And the second one is we have we have an application layer protocol that allows host to query the distributed database. So that means I have the database in my DNS server. Now, being I am the host, by using my application layer protocol, I should send a query to the DNS server asking for please translate this host name into IP address. Now, what is DNS server? DNS server is nothing but something like a Unix machine, okay, which will maintain its database. So now this query and all we are going to send by using a protocol called as UDP. Okay, right. So now, as like in DNS, which is there in application layer protocols, which includes this HTTP, SMTP, and FTP also. Now, what are the process in translation from one host name to IP address? That is what the 5 steps are there. The first step, what it is going to do is that the same user machine runs the client side of the DNS application. Okay, it will runs the DNS application where how it will runs the DNS application. Now, whatever I have typed in the browser, the host name, it will extract that host name from the URL and passes the host name to the client side of the DNS application. Okay, so it will send to the client side of the DNS application. After that, the DNS client sends a query containing the host name to a DNS server. As I told, I should send a query by having a host name. So that query with a host name will be sent to a DNS server. Now, the fourth one, what happens is that now DNS client will get a reply from the DNS server which includes the IP address of that host name. Right. So I got the IP address. Now, once the browser receives the IP address from the DNS, it can initiate a TCP connection to the HTTP server. We know that the port number is 80 to that IP address. Now, these are all the 5 steps normally the DNS is going to perform. Is it clear?